Alrighty. Hello everyone. Welcome to our September Science Communication webinar. As usual, we're going to ask that you keep your cameras off and your mics muted. And as you have questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat, and we will have a chance to ask David those questions at the end of the presentation. So today we have David Goodfried, our District 8 Fisheries Biologist, and he is going to be presenting on walleye management in Western North Carolina. All right, take it away, David.
All right, thank you, Heather, and good morning, WRC. Pleasure to be here and talk about some of the efforts we are currently doing with regards to walleye management in Western North Carolina. And the purpose of today's talk, I think what I'm going to start by doing is a narrow focus. We're going to look at a case study on a specific reservoir, and that is Lake James in Western North Carolina, and use it to really talk about walleye management and have we studied one particular area for some time, and now we have information really moving forward that influences the grander program of what we try to do in the mountain region regarding our walleye management program. And so a lot hinges on Lake James, so I thought it would be interesting, at least hopefully, to start there. And then hopefully by the end of the presentation, we'll see how that influences the grander program as a whole. And so starting, where is Lake James? It is in Western North Carolina, in particular, McDowell and Burke counties. It is the uppermost Catawba River chain of reservoirs impoundment. It is a Duke Energy-owned lake. It was first impounded in 1923. Fairly small reservoir as far as reservoirs go, about 6,500 surface acres. And two major arteries, two major rivers, literally were impounded to pretty much create this reservoir, and that is the Catawba River, which generally flows on its western shore, as well as the Linville River, which comes through a national gorge area, and it comes from the northeast pretty much. And so a canal was, constructed to connect those two lobes, what makes, in a sense, Lake James. And to show that from an aerial imagery perspective, we can see here the Catawba arm over here on the western side. You can probably tell the distinct water clarity differences there. Catawba River generally flows through agricultural land, so it's going to be your more nutrient-rich portion of Lake James, and because of that, species like largemouth bass, catfish, and crappie were historically targeted on this side of the reservoir, while the Linville River arm basically harbored species like smallmouth bass, white bass, and walleye. So what do we know about walleye in general? Just a little bit of biology about this critter. Very cool looking fish. They have this glassy eye. I guess vitreous in Latin is somewhere around the word glassy. And that glassiness is this large luminous eye that allows them to see well in low light conditions. And so when you hold a walleye, pretty neat looking animal, lots of teeth, and you can tell it's a large predator. When we talk about where they're native to, at least in this country, we look at two major river basins. That is the Mississippi and Missouri. They're extremely popular in the upper Midwest, and I would even add the Northeast. And they're prized by anglers because they do get rather large 10-pound walleye. They're not uncommon, some of these more popular fisheries in that part of the world. But more importantly, they are really sought after because they are excellent table fare. And so if any of you have had the opportunity to consume walleye and eat fish, it is a very pleasant, tasty morsel, if you will. And if you couple that with some of your favorite sides, coleslaw, smoked mac and cheese, baked beans, hush puppies, slaw, and you top that off with Nana's banana pudding, you're going to have yourself an absolutely wonderful meal and quite tasty. But definitely prized for their excellent food qualities, and I definitely would recommend trying walleye if you haven't and you do like to consume fish. This animal generally prefers cooler water environments, hence why most of their distribution of where they're from typically has been in northern environments, at least in this country. And they are patagamous. And so that's a large word that I don't even get to say a lot. The biologists, we really don't use a lot. So I'm going to say it again, patagamous. I may not get the opportunity to say that again. And basically, that's a large word that means they complete their entire life cycle in one environment. And in particular, they move as adults from main stem portions of reservoirs or lakes where they spend most of their time, But when it becomes spring, they migrate into the rivers that feed these lakes or reservoirs in order to spawn. Once they do, eggs of females are deposited along cobble or gravel substrate, where they initially sink. They're fertilized by males. They go on from there to develop, hatch, and then those fry eventually make their way back to the rivers and into the reservoirs or lakes which they came from. They continue to grow, and then once they become sexually mature, they migrate again to complete their life cycle in the spring of the following year or beyond. So pretty cool animal that gets a lot of attention, especially in the spring months from shorebound anglers, because it's kind of that effect of, long, cold winters, especially in the North Country. And here they are making their spawning runs when it starts to warm up. It's kind of the signal that spring is here, if you will. So it gets a lot of attention from a fishery perspective. Efforts in Lake James, when we talk about walleye, where did it all begin? Way back in 1949 were the first stockings in Lake James. These were around 10,000 fry that were stocked. And then stocking halted in 1955 because there was evidence of natural reproduction. So these animals were just doing fine on their own from those stockings and really didn't need to stock from that point on. However, public pressure resulted in us begin stocking this fish again in the 1980s. And then a study was conducted by one of our biologists, Doug Besseler, at the time, who demonstrated these stockings really weren't contributing much to the fishery, and that fishery was indeed, in fact, sustained by natural reproduction. Other approaches to improve the Lake James walleye fishery over time, we enacted a 15-inch minimum size limit to allow females to reach reproductive size. Through our estimated growth, through many of our surveys, we found that females basically were sexually matured about 15 inches, so some efforts to protect them. Also, there was an angling moratoria that was enacted on the Liver River portion and that side of Lake James that basically didn't allow anglers to harvest any fish during the spawning time. And that time generally was somewhere between mid-February and mid-April. Also, we've enhanced our habitat in the reservoir by installing these large rock reef and gravel bars. But most of our effort really was to limit the introduction of unwanted species. And the way we did that was through outreach efforts, various signage and postings and regulations. Many anglers, as you imagine, don't realize that it is in fact illegal to move one fish from one water body to another. And in many cases, it's harmless on their behalf, not knowing the difference. However, it can cause irreversible damage. And it's something we're constantly battling as biologists almost on an annual year of something being moved to where it's not supposed to be. When we talk about one of those animals affecting walleye, these river herring, which is seen here on the right picture, was really what we were concerned about. These critters, these river herring, are native to the Atlantic Ocean, but when they're moved inland in these reservoirs and those fisheries contain walleye, we have known and seen very devastating effects in populations, in particular declines. And two of those species are alewife and blueback herring that we were really concerned about. They hadn't been documented in Lake James prior to a time, but we knew that they were downstream in the rest of the Catawba River systems. And so we tried to prevent this as best we could. What do we know about river herring impacts to walleye fisheries? Lots of research out there, especially from the Great Lakes, that demonstrated that once these critters get into systems, you usually see declines in walleye populations. Pal Wheeler, our District 9 biologist in the mid-2000s, also demonstrated a dramatic decline in the Hiwassee River reservoir population upon blueback herring introductions. And then what are the mechanisms exactly? Well, these fish are ovivorous, which means they do consume eggs of other species. And so when these walleye make their large spawning runs in the spring, these river herring, in fact, follow them up the rivers, hang out and wait and consume a lot of their eggs. Also, there's some evidence river herring are very rich in an enzyme called thioaminase, and this thioaminase inhibits thiamine production in fishes. And so what thiamine does basically is an essential compound in the early life development stages of fish, in particular the egg and larval stages. So it has been postulated that diets rich in river herring inhibit that and can cause large-scale population crashes because of that development hasn't been inhibited from an egg production and larval perspective. And so it's not good if these animals show up. Well, despite our best effort to try to prevent them from spreading, they eventually did, and along with them was a host of other fish species. Beginning in 2008, when white perch were first discovered, this is an estuarine fish, primarily from the Atlantic side, but evidence has suggested that these white perch compete with species such as white bass and walleye at juvenile stages. In 2010, blueback herring were first identified in Lake James. In 2011, both blueback and alewife were collected in a reservoir shoreline black bass survey. And in 2012, all three of these species were documented in large numbers in Lake James. And if that wasn't enough, in 2016, one of the single largest threats to black bass conservation and management, the Alabama bass, was detected in Lake James as well. So these systems, these artificial environments, they do change, and they change quite rapidly. And one of the things that we always try to prevent is this from happening, but you can only do so much. When animals move, like I say, they can cause irreversible damage. And this was a great concern once we knew river herring were in fact documented in Lake James. And so that began us to initiate a study, knowing what the potential would be, and that is the walleye population could crash as a result, because we've seen this throughout the country in various research studies. So in 2012, we initiated a study to determine if stocking fingerling walleye would contribute to the natural fishery. We would do this by stocking 30,000 fingerlings a year. And we also wanted to determine whether stocking location mattered. You know, we picked 3 locations throughout Lake James to evaluate to see if we would see return better in any one of these locations over another. And we also wanted to ask the question and answer the question, will stocking fry help? And so we have different life stages. We would investigate fingerling stockings on an annual basis. And then if available, which happened to be 2015, we wanted to see if stocking 500,000 fry would also recruit to the fishery. And lastly, we wanted to know if parentage-based tagging, that is using modern genetic techniques as a tagging tool, is that a better tool than OTC, which stands for oxytetracycline hydrochloride, which is a fish antibiotic that we are able to soak these juveniles in for a time period, and that chemical is uptaken in calcified structures. And it's a way that once we section those calcified structures, we can look at them under fluorescent light and actually be able to determine if those fish in fact were hatchery origin. So basically it was a comparison between these two methods, parentage-based tagging as well as OTC, to determine hatchery contribution of our stockings. So we get down to some of the science side. Basically what we tried to do was collect walleye brood stock in the early spring as they made these spawning runs. And then all these brood stocks were genetically typed at the time by Heather Evans' lab at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Science. The fry collected from these brood stocks were used to verify 13 genetic markers that would determine hatchery origin. 30,000 fingerlings were stocked in the spring at 3 different locations, 10,000 each in one of those locations. And we'd evaluate our stockings in the fall using experimental gill nets throughout Lake James. From that information of collected walleye, we would look at things like how many fish there were, catch rates, if you will, size of walleye, as well as age structure of the population. And then these collected fish, walleye that is, was clipped to obtain genetic information and compared to broodstock. And then parentage-based tagging we used to verify hatchery contribution of each fish compared to all broodstock. So did they come from our hatcheries, ultimately is the question. Otoliths were pulled, which are inner ear bones that we use to age fish. And then from those otoliths and those sections, we would evaluate if this OTC marking was there and therefore determine if it was hatchery origin as well to compare those two methodologies. So this was kind of the effort that we conducted to look at some of that parentage-based tagging. These are some photos of the actual spawning process at Table Rock Fish Hatchery. The upper left picture shows a female being strip spawned. So once these animals are taken from the wild, they're brought to our hatcheries. They are strip spawned, as you can see there, and then 3 males will also be strip spawned to this female, for instance, to fertilize the eggs. Once those eggs are fertilized, they're placed in hatching jars where they're allowed to be tumbled, if you will, in well oxygenated water. And then these aquariums in the bottom right, once those eggs hatch and fry swim up, they then come over to these tanks and are allowed there before they are moved to ponds to grow out. But as part of this genetic component, we not only took fin clips of all broodstock we brought in to verify the parents, if you will, we also took samples to confirm whether the progeny coming from those fish were in fact their offspring. And therefore, once we had those markers, then we knew, once we kept those lots separated, that any return we saw in the wild, we could use those markers to determine if the fish actually came from Table Rock Hatchery or not. So pretty cool marking technique. Takes a lot of effort, as you might expect, to keep these cohorts really separated and to determine whether we see return from our hatcheries. What did the catches of walleye look like in our gill nets over time? And I have 2 time periods here, if you will. That red line basically is the time that we first documented river herring in Lake James. This time period before essentially is the time of natural recruitment where these animals were doing well on their own. And we can see, even though it took a few years after this introduction, a precipitous decline in the overall walleye population as these fish started to age out from these natural recruitment years. Further way to explain this and some of our concern is actually looking at the age structure. Down here on the x-axis on the bottom are ages of walleye. And I just wanted to point out on some of these histograms, in particular this left side, is this before time period where natural reproduction was king. And if you can see, the furthest to the left of those histograms are basically age 0 and age 1 individuals. In 2006 through 2009, you can see there was constant representation of those younger fish, which is a very good thing. You can't have an older population, right, if you don't eventually have a younger one. So you constantly want to see these small fish come into the fishery. Well, look after blueback herring and alewife were introduced in 2010. From the 2012 sample, we completely see, indicated by that red circle, a missing year class. This is one of the first times in Lake James history, through all the data that we've set since the early 90s, where we observed this. So our concerns actually became reality. The good news is, as we started stocking in 2012, about this time, we started to notice these impacts. And here, seen in 2013 and 2014, evidence suggests some of these younger fish begin showing back up into the fishery. The question is, were they from us or were they naturally reproduced, right? And so that's where this percent contribution, that is, which one of these techniques was good at determining hatchery contribution? Or were any of these fish produced from us, or somehow did they start to naturally reproduce on their own? Well, the bottom line is, according to our table here, is both marking methods were effective at determining percent contribution. Both PBT showed a 99% return and OTC showed a 92% return. So both high. So on a grander scale, what does that mean? That means when we look at the age structure toward the end of our study, these first 4 cohorts, if you will, ages 0 to 3, basically were completely produced in our hatcheries. So not only did we have that using these modern genetic techniques, as well as OTC marking to be able to prove that, we were essentially, in fact, supporting the Lake James walleye fishery through hatchery production. This hasn't ever happened. Normally, these fish were doing well on their own, but since these herring were introduced, it did essentially cause a total recruitment collapse. The good news is we were seeing return from our hatcheries. But how would we measure success? If we knew we were contributing to the overall fishery, you have to have some type of barometer that suggests what you're doing is working. It's one thing to get return of those animals. It's another thing to get those numbers back up to where a population is strong and is healthy and vibrant once again. So this is age one catch rates in our fall gill nets. Again, I have outlined those two time periods when the fish were doing fine on their own through this before natural recruitment days. Once herring were introduced, we see an absolute crash in the fishery of our age ones even. In 2012, we began stocking and we see a small incline over that time period. But the problem is we're about 1/6 of where those historic catch rates used to be. So in fact, if our barometer was going to be, we wanted at least these catch rates to get back up to what they were historically, we were a long way from doing that. We simply weren't producing enough fish and stocking enough fish theoretically to get us back to where the population was and where our anglers expected the population to be from a fishery perspective. What about location and life stage? If you remember, we talked about when we did stock our fingerlings produced it in our hatcheries, we wanted to see if any one of these locations was better than the other, right? Because in a world where we are limited by pond space at many of our facilities, we only have a certain number of ponds dedicated. And not to mention, because fish are being raised to stock all over the state, pond space is at a premium. And certainly we can't pull walleye out of the air. And so you want to make sure what you're using is getting the best bang for the buck, so to speak. So looking at these locations and our return in our gill nets, we in fact did see a pretty stark difference in where these animals were stocked and where they came from originally and recruited to our nets. So basically 51% of the animals that we collected in our gill nets, these walleye, were stocked at Canal Bridge, and 47% of the return was from the Linville River. So the Catawba River basically was not proving to us anyway with any measure of certainty that stocking them was a good idea. And if anything, we were wasting those resources and those animals. So beginning in 2017, we thought, well, let's take these down to 2 locations at minimum. In addition to that, if you recall, I mentioned maybe we would try some fry as well. That 500,000 fry that we stocked, not one single fry recruited to the fishery from our fall gill nets, which told us that probably wasn't a good option to try fry stocking because fingerlings seem to do much better, at least in this study. So in conclusion, through the introductions of these invasive species, we did see the population of walleye negatively impacted. Our field data suggested there was a total recruitment failure, and we began stocking 30,000 fish in 2012 to offset this recruitment issues. Our fall gill net data showed almost 100% hatchery contribution. So in fact, we were literally supporting the Lake James walleye fishery artificially from our hatchery stockings. Our age one catch rates, though, were only about 1/6 of historical value. So it did not appear we were stocking enough to make a difference to the overall fishery, at least what we were accustomed to seeing when they were doing fine on their own and reproducing. Parentage-based tagging and OTC marking were both effective at determining hatchery contribution. However, PBT allowed us to answer some additional questions. We did see differential recruitment, and we understood that the Catawba River was not recruiting fish at all. So beginning in 2017, we recommended that we'd only stock these locations to maximize our return. So there was a lot done here in this particular research to get us to a point of making some subtle adjustments. But 2017 to 2024, that's some time ago, right? Where are we now in our measurement efforts in Lake James? And so I kind of wanted to share a current graph with you that outlines these time periods. That time period in black, if you will, on the left side of this figure indicates a time where these critters were doing fine on their own. They were reproducing and self-supporting the fishery. The dotted line there is when blueback herring were illegally introduced and documented. We see that crash in our age one catch rates of the population. And then these areas of red start to come in where we began stocking to try to rebound the population. From 2012 to 2016, we did see some form of an increase. However, we were about 1/6 of where we needed to be. What is very encouraging is we look to the right side of that figure, we see 30,000 fingerlings increase to 180,000 fingerlings. And not only that, with an increase, we see almost an immediate notice in our catch rates of age 1 fish, to where not only they met historical values, in some respects, they exceeded them. So how in the world did we go from 30,000 fingerlings to 180,000 fingerlings? I know some of you are like, you're talking about pond space and capacity issues and species being raised all within our hatcheries. Where did we have room for this? Well, we started to look at our hatcheries across the state. The Bobby N. Setzer hatchery there in Transylvania County and the Armstrong hatchery in McDowell County, these are our cold water facilities. They primarily do trout, and they do it extremely well, stocking over 1 million trout across the state and Western North Carolina in particular. So they certainly weren't going to be able to give us what we need in terms of walleye. They didn't have the available space. The Marion hatchery is a small facility. They really didn't have the infrastructure to produce walleye there, so that definitely wasn't an option. Table Rock was kindly the only player in town. They were raising all of our walleye for the state, doing an exceptional job. They were simply out of space. So we looked east at McKinney Lake. They were neck deep in channel catfish production, as well as smallmouth bass in the later years. And so there really wasn't an opportunity there. And so we contacted David Deaton, our fish production supervisor, and was like, David, does Jeff Evans down in Watha, I believe that's Pender County, have any room on his facility? Would he be willing to give walleye a try? And he said, I don't know, we'll check it out, we'll see. And lo and behold, Jeff was like, sure, we're willing to give it a try. And because of the collaboration with Jeff and his staff, we transported walleye down there. And the simple question is, did it work? And not only did it work in a very large way. They were able to devote 4 to 5 ponds that first year, get us up to that request. You know, from our research, we said, well, we were 1/6 of where we needed to be. Let's at least start with the 6-time increase. That's asking a lot of our production. It's asking a lot for those guys to harvest these critters. It's asking a lot to truck them across the state, but it worked. And working with them really has changed the way that we manage walleye in Lake James. The problem with this figure, as some of you might have noticed, you see this decline in 2022 and 2023, at least certainly lower than what you saw in 2020 and 2021. What might be driving that? Did we not stock as many? Well, in fact, we stocked sometimes more than we did in 2019 when we first started it, or in 2020 where we saw immediate return the next year. So it wasn't a stocking numbers thing. Some of this is what just natural variation that we'd expect to see from stocking a particular fishery. Variation in catch rates is normal to some extent, especially when you're producing these fish and stocking them from hatcheries and their contribution to a fishery. But then we started to ask the question, well, if that is natural variation, is there any other type of metric we could use to determine or not if our stockings have been successful? And we got to thinking, you know, we've been collecting a lot of brood stock for propagation for many years out of the Catawba River. I wonder if we took those data and looked at them long term, what it would show us. And so I wanted to share with everyone where we are to date, at least in the past 6 years. And once we began stocking 180,000 fingerlings, these are the number of walleyes that we're actually taking to our hatcheries or what we're experiencing in the river during the spawning runs. And from 2019 to 2024, we basically have seen a 4-fold increase of female walleyes in the river since these elevated stockings, and over a 2-fold increase of males, which equals almost a 2.5-fold increase in the number of walleye returning to these rivers, trying to do their things through their normal spawning runs. This was astounding. Well, then we wanted to plot it back to the whole area of where we were stocking again, back in our research from 2012 to 2016. And here we can see that despite our best efforts of stocking 30,000 fingerlings from 2012 to 2016, by 2017, those older fish from those naturally recruited years were dying out, and we see an 80 to 90% decline in the number of fish we were seeing in our fall or in our spring brood fish collections. In 2019, this red line indicated where we began stocking 180,000 fingerlings, so six-fold increase there, and then an absolute increase from that point on. To the point in 2024, we were seeing just as many, if not more, fish that were primarily young, age 5 or less, than we did way back in 2012 when the population had at least 50% more age classes available. There were 12 age classes in 2012. So some of those older fish were still alive, thriving in the population. But over time, they began to age out. Those declines became noticed. And then now, through these efforts, the fish now we're placing in Lake James appear to be not only returning to our gill net catch rates, but we're also seeing in the rivers. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. Lake James is not only supported through these broodfish efforts itself. These fish that are taken to the hatchery on a larger extent support the entire walleye management program. These are the other reservoirs within our program that we stock with walleye or have stocked over time. Through the efforts of Lake James and this apparent rebounding fishery, not only is it easier for us as biologists to get our hands on the animals to take to our hatcheries to raise them. Back when the population was crashing and severely declining, sometimes we would spend upwards to 3 weeks of effort just to get enough walleye to raise in our hatcheries to support the program. This past spring, it only took a day and a half. So that's an effective use of time. That's being more efficient. But not only that, with the addition of Watha State Fish Hatchery and bringing on McKinney Lake Fish Hatchery this past year, we're now seeing more walleye available than we ever have before, not only to stock in Lake James to make sure we see the return and rebound of that fishery, we essentially have more walleye than we ever have to investigate whether or not we can take some of these other fisheries that we're stocking at 5 fish an acre, like we were Lake James, and increase them to 10, 15, 20 plus fish an acre. So I truly believe that through a program like this, we're kind of on the brink of seeing what our walleye management can do in these other places. And it may have taken us 2.5 decades to get to this point, but mind you, the largest changes we've seen in these reservoirs didn't take place over the last 20 years. Really, we're talking in the last 10. And so we're having to adjust on the fly, but I believe through the efforts at Lake James and the case history there, the future is rather bright. And for the first time, we were able to make a stocking allocation model to where we know how many fish are going to specific reservoirs, trying to meet those requests, and then any surplus walleye that we raise in our facilities through the amazing production efforts of all these hatcheries and their staff, we're able to put more walleye simply into some of these places to try to bolster those numbers and get these fisheries back from the declines that we've seen in places like Lake James, as well as the rest of the state. Because the fact of the matter is the walleye demand is ever growing. You can see kind of this steady range, if you will, from the mid 2000s. But as we started to investigate what was going on in our walleye fisheries, it was apparent these declines and these invasive species introductions has really led us to need more and more walleye to kind of offset some of these declines in recruitment failures. As you can imagine, over 2.5 decades worth of work in Lake James, there's been so many people that have worked, biologists through the years, coordinators, production staff, technicians. It's been a team effort. We've come a long way, but I think really we're at a good point. And I think really the next 5 to 10 years is going to show us some things in this program maybe we haven't seen for some time. Simply put, because now we have the resources available to us because of the excellent staff and production willing to work, seeing the need, having the pond space, and ultimately seeing the return through our research to prove, in fact, this is working and the future potentially could be bright. So with that, I will quit rambling. I want to thank everyone for their time, and I would be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, David. That was a great presentation. A reminder, if anybody has any questions, to go ahead and drop those in the chat and I'll read them out for David to answer them. I had a question as you were presenting. I was wondering, with the increase in walleye that you're seeing, do you have any evidence that part of that increase is now coming from natural recruitment again?
We don't have any evidence of that. I will say this, that in these spawning runs where we were collecting our brood stock, there were days when the river herring were first introduced that many times in those efforts of collecting walleye, you literally could not see the substrate in the river. There were so many river herring. Now, when you go and collect walleye, we just don't see that many. Matter of fact, this spring, I can't tell you if we saw a single individual. So I know that there's probably booms and busts with those invasive species as well. But right now, just based on the data that we have, it appears that those stockings have correlated with these higher catch rates. The plan, Heather, in the future, that if we continue to see this rebounding trend, then maybe we can mark those fish again and really see if these fish returning not only to the river are ours, but is there evidence of any natural recruitment that's since taken place because of this apparent decrease in the overall river herring population? But that's an excellent question.
Awesome. One more. Are you hearing any angler reports of them seeing more walleye in Lake James now?
We are. And I always said that there were two barometers that I would use, that if our efforts were really taking hold, and one of that would be the walleye broodfish return. And so that's check one. Number two, we are hearing a lot of anglers catching walleye in these historic fishing locations, and you just didn't hear a lot of that in years past. Not only that, we're having black bass anglers catching them even in the spring on laydowns. When we do our largemouth bass electrofishing shoreline surveys, we're even shocking walleye at the end of laydowns that we used to see back in those early 2000 time periods again. And so just visually and being on the boat and some random surveys, seeing more walleye show up, I view that as a good thing. And of course, when your anglers are catching them again and you're starting to get word of that, that always lets you feel good about what you're doing. So yes.
Great. All right. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to present to us today. It's great to hear a success story. And we'll invite everyone to join us next month. We're going to have Doug Howell, our migratory game bird coordinator, presenting on the history and status of resident Canada geese in North Carolina. So we hope to see everyone there. Thanks, everyone.